Battlefield 6 has a lot riding on it. After a mixed reception for 2021's Battlefield 2042, this is a more back-to-basics entry, harkening back to earlier games like Battlefields 3 and 4. So does Battlefield 6 meet player expectations, and does it satisfy visually on PS5 consoles? Battlefield 6 looks best in its single-player campaign. Its most striking moments come during frenetic action scenes, like these shots where the player is buffeted by explosives. Expect spectacular pyrotechnics that throw up chunks of physicalized debris and red-hot embers, with trailing clouds of smoke. Much of this is for show, but in limited areas, you're able to engage Battlefield's signature destruction system to render structures to rubble, punching through with armaments from a sledgehammer to a tank. Single-player animation is excellent, with snappy ADS, tight visual recoil, and crisp reload animations. Reloads bear some similarity to gun animation in recent Call of Duty games, where pauses hang and movement accelerates. By default, expect a healthy amount of camera shake as well when explosives detonate or the player sprints. Battlefield 6 has a responsive feel that I think players will really enjoy. There are some beautiful vistas in here too, within certain limits. Battlefield 6 is largely set during lighting conditions that favor rasterization, with sharp direct lights and deep shadows, which gives scenes appropriate contrast and punch. Foliage-rich outdoor scenes are common as sun filters through tree branches and flares against the camera lens. Lighting that is less ideally situated can be good too, like in this bombed-out palatial interior, which depends more on indirect lighting. Geometric density is pretty high. There's no nanite-style virtualized geometry system here, but environmental assets look crisp and hold up well at typical gameplay distances. In general, the environment looks quite stable, with minimal pop-in, especially during infantry gameplay. Moving at a faster clip in vehicles provokes more obvious transitions, but these were not that noticeable outside of a few moments during the campaign. But for most people, I think the standout features of the campaign lie in performance. 60 FPS is the target here in the game's balanced mode on PS5, and the game typically delivers a flat 60 FPS reading during gameplay. Plus, Battlefield 6 has excellent motion blur that makes it feel even smoother than the frame rate figures would imply. The game's only real performance quirks came in one late-game mission, where animation would halt for about 1 to 3 frames sometimes during high-speed traversal, though the game was updating during these frames, so the frame rate itself was technically not affected. I didn't spot this issue in other missions or other game content. Image quality is pretty impressive too. In balanced mode, we get a 1440p-like resolve, with internal resolutions that are usually pretty close to 1440p, likely using FSR based on comparisons from the beta. For a 60 FPS console game, those are pretty high figures, and the game looks very stable in typical play. There's also a performance mode, which apparently targets a slightly lower 1280p output according to the developers, with internal resolutions often in the 1080p range, at least at 120Hz output. Image quality takes a small hit with this option, and other visual settings get knocked back a bit too. Expect lower shadow quality, lower quality LODs, worse draw distance, and chunkier reflections. We get an unlocked frame rate here, which means performance that averages around 95 FPS or so during gameplay. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to capture this directly owing to a scheduling conflict, but my VRR monitoring indicated that it averaged in the 90s typically with some variance. You can run this mode without VRR or at 60Hz output, but you really shouldn't as it serves little purpose at 60Hz output and has awful screen tearing if VRR isn't enabled. We'll do some cross-console comparisons in future content, but performance is pretty solid on PS5 at the moment. When Battlefield 6 is firing on all cylinders, it's a visual treat. Ultra-smooth performance with excellent image quality pairs well with fast, explosive action. This is exactly what a lot of online punters are asking for, a current-gen console game that focuses less on advanced visual features and more on a crisp feel. But that focus leads to some obvious visual issues as well, which mostly come down to problems with lighting. The game's GI is coarse and suffers from obvious light leak in places, where indirect light bleeds through thin barriers. Dynamic objects like characters often look out of place as they don't get a proper GI contribution. The game's SSAO is of particular concern. It tends to leave harsh halos, over-occluding fine details like intersections between walls and ground, or in shrubs and small bits of foliage. and it disappears when its occluder falls out of screen space, making it look temporally inconsistent at times. Shadows can be another pain point. A lot of lights aren't shadow casting, leaving harsh leaks. Shadow resolution is often pretty low, and cascade lines between higher and lower res shadow maps are obvious. Shadows cast from the player don't perfectly line up with the character model used in first-person view, creating some odd-looking incongruities. And lights from a night vision camera or gun-mounted flashlight can produce some awkward shadow artifacts. Finally, reflections are approximate and rely on SSR and cube maps. Glossy reflective surfaces are used fairly sparingly throughout the campaign, so the usual issues are mostly not that apparent here. But expect the usual obvious SSR artifacts, along with other issues from time to time. A lot of ink has been spilled over the decision to not use ray tracing as part of Battlefield 6's lighting, even as an option for PC players, and I think in these areas, we find the weaknesses of that approach. A good per-pixel RTGI in particular could clean up a lot of the game's lighting flaws. Battlefield 6 has plenty of cutscene sequences, though there are some odd issues. Some real-time cutscenes run at 60 FPS, in line with gameplay in the balanced mode, and some run at 30 FPS. These seem to mix together with no particular rhyme or reason. This sequence, for instance, hums along at 60 FPS just fine, but a cutscene a few seconds later drops the refresh down to 30 FPS again. Even though it's a first-person scene that transitions directly from gameplay, these scenes do kick in higher quality visual settings, so it's possible they are just falling over budget, but if so, I'd rather take a momentary loss in resolution or a few dropped frames. Plus, the character rendering in these sequences isn't great, with somewhat dead-eyed and plastic-skinned actors. The game does make use of pre-rendered sequences for its frame story, which do exhibit consistently better rendering quality. These offline scenes play back at 30 FPS as well. Finally, as an overall note here, I don't think the campaign itself is all that amazing. This is a very linear shooter campaign, in the Call of Duty style, but probably not up to that quality bar. Expect fairly one-note gameplay with thin plot justification. It just doesn't feel very much like Battlefield, as encounters tend to be smaller scale, and the limited number of vehicle sequences mostly consist of driving forward in a straight line. One late-game mission is the only real exception. Operation Ember Strike starts as a small-scale sandbox, with some limited player freedom in objective order and approach. That freedom is constrained somewhat as the mission proceeds, but there's at least some driving that isn't on rails and a bit of gameplay variety. The final mission also provides some extra room to maneuver, with somewhat larger gameplay spaces. Some reporting has suggested the campaign had to be rebuilt late in the development process, and I think you can see how the final product doesn't totally cohere. To the developer's credit though, it feels reasonably glitch-free. The campaign crashed once, the menu sometimes failed to open, and I spotted the occasional path-finding issue or awkward cutscene start, but it's in reasonable shape for launch. I didn't poke around the edges too much though, so your mileage may vary. Overall, it's a decent little romp if you come in with reasonable expectations. Loading for the campaign levels can take a bizarrely long time though for a current generation game, as this campaign load took well over 30 seconds, with a pitch black screen for most of that time. These loads aren't an issue once you're in-game, but I don't think this behavior is intended. In common with the single player, Battlefield 6's multiplayer looks best in broad open environmental views, where the combination of good geometric density and sharp lighting produces some satisfying shots. More foliage-rich maps tend to look the most appealing to me, like Saints Quarter and Mirak Valley. I think it often looks a little more flattering in multiplayer though than the campaign, just because the pace of multiplayer play is fast, and slowing down to gawk at rubble or plants is often a death sentence. In multiplayer, there are some slightly dodgy looking interiors though. Very basic looking areas that feel like they could be lifted from decade-old Battlefield games. On the plus side though, the screen space reflections I noted from the second Battlefield beta weekend in DF Direct 227 have been toned down substantially in the Empire State map, which minimizes unpleasant SSR artifacts. Image quality and performance also remain strong in multiplayer. Balanced mode looks sharp and runs at a stable 60 FPS in my experience, while the performance mode hits about 80 FPS on average in VRR capture at high player counts. For a multiplayer shooter on consoles, it's hard to ask for more. After the Battlefield 6 multiplayer beta, I had some lingering questions about certain mechanics in online play, namely the prevalence of destructible elements in the environment. In the final game, the structures that tend to be destructible are flat-faced buildings in light colors, like these houses. These buildings come apart in pre-scored sections, like in prior Battlefield games. It's primarily a state-based destruction system, and not a physics-based one. This entails different things for different kinds of structures. You can blow square-shaped chunks out of the storage facility, for instance, but you can't damage its metal frame nor take down the whole structure. Buildings with metal frames typically have substantial indestructible portions. Conversely, some structures like these houses can be taken down almost entirely, with chunks of building falling down as their supports are destroyed. Most smaller barriers and bits of environmental decoration can be exploded or driven through as well if you apply sufficient force. Some buildings occupy more of a middle space, like this freestanding dwelling, which can mostly be destroyed but has two opposing walls that don't sustain any damage, or like these storefronts, where the front facade can collapse completely, but structural interior walls are invulnerable. And then there are structures that really only suffer cosmetic blemishes. In Iberian Offensive, most of the upper floors of the buildings can be blown out, but their more gameplay-relevant bottom floors are usually impervious to player actions. This exterior wall on Manhattan Bridge has plenty of little pillars that can sustain chip damage, but the wall they brace can't be damaged at all. Battlefield 6's destruction isn't categorically different from anything we've seen in recent series entries, with buildings that come apart in familiar ways for series veterans. It's just more visually satisfying than prior efforts, with plenty of accompanying debris whenever a building comes down or a pre-scored section is punched through. And destruction is used more liberally here than in recent entries. Battlefield 6 feels like it is more densely laden with destructible elements than the past few Battlefield games, though Bad Company 2 is probably still the all-time champ for the series. The more infantry-focused, debris-dense map design probably helps a good deal there. The destruction is also more apparent than in the game's single-player campaign, which features more bespoke structures that can't be meaningfully damaged. I'd love to comment on other elements of the online gameplay, but I mostly played against bots in the pre-release review period, as the servers had very low population. These characters provide good cannon fodder, but aren't tuned too aggressively, and their aim isn't very accurate. We weren't able to play any Portal games either, owing to pre-release content limitations, and the game's Battle Royale mode isn't making launch. I don't feel like my impressions of the multiplayer from the beta will be all that different for the final game though. This is a tightly tuned, infantry-focused combat experience that closely resembles certain prior Battlefield games, particularly 2011's Battlefield 3. Recent series excursions into hero-based classes and 128-player matches have been discarded. Large-scale gameplay gimmicks like Levolution and Behemoths are gone, and a modern military theme is back. Expect smaller additions instead, like the introduction of the sledgehammer and ladder for the assault class, which aren't as headline-grabbing. But this is a game that relies more on excellent execution than innovative ideas. As a final note here, Battlefield 6 has a range of configurables that apply both to its multiplayer and single-player offerings that I wanted to touch on. Right when you download the game, you're presented with a selection of content to download. The default is to download all components, but you can pick and choose what you'd like. This apes the conventions of the Call of Duty titles, which are absolutely massive and have many different installable components to choose from. Most of these selections are pretty self-explanatory, but the HD content wasn't as clear to me. So I decided to compare the game with no HD content downloaded versus the game with all HD content downloaded. In practice, the differences tend to be pretty subtle during gameplay. During the introductory cutscenes and a few levels though, we can make out plenty of additional close-range texture detail with the full download. The stamped metal here is obviously higher res, as is the chair in this shot. We do need to be quite close to the models to see the full benefit though. For most players, I'd keep the HD content loaded while playing the respective modes. But if you need an extra 20 gigabytes or 30 gigabytes, you can probably dispatch them without creating huge visual issues. The game's texture art is reasonably high-res, even absent the HD content packs, and typical gameplay views don't draw you close enough to appreciate the extra texture detail most of the time. The game also carries in-game selections for tweakables beyond graphical modes. An FOV slider provides options between 85 degrees and 120 degrees, with a default of 90. Competitively minded players and monitor users will want to crank this up, while the default 90 degrees will suit more casual TV users who want a less warped presentation. There's a sharpness slider too. The default 50 value is how I've captured the footage in this video, and it's a touch over sharp to me, while the maximum 100 value has very obvious edge ringing. Conversely though, 0 is a bit soft. I'd probably recommend something around 20 or 30, which feels about right, although tastes may vary. Finally, the game has 2 motion blur sliders. Most games provide a simple motion blur on-off toggle, or perhaps a few strength presets, but Battlefield 6 provides 2 full sliders, with a scale for weapon motion blur and world motion blur. The world motion blur slider has 100 potential values, which is perhaps a bit excessive, but it works okay. But the weapon motion blur slider has 1000 potential values, representing digits from 0 to 100 and the decimals in between. Sometimes the acceleration doesn't work when you try to push through these values, so it can be tedious to try out different motion blur settings or to tweak other settings that also have 1000 values, like aim sensitivity. Overall, I think Battlefield 6 is a successful game. This is a title that is precisely targeted towards player feedback, with a set of gameplay features that caters to core fans. The popular elements from prior games are back, while the unpopular and unpolished ones get the boot. If you liked Battlefields 3 and 4, you'll probably like this one too. I really enjoyed those games, and I think Battlefield 6 is pretty great too, at least in multiplayer. At the same time though, there's a conservatism to its multiplayer design that constrains its ambitions a bit. Don't expect anything earth-shattering from the single player either, which feels a little bit disjointed. And visually, while the core graphics are stronger than ever, its AAA contemporaries have pushed further still with advanced lighting tech and virtualized geometry systems. The total lack of any ray tracing support is somewhat befuddling as well, given that Battlefield 5 was the first major game with ray tracing on PC, and Battlefield 2042 featured ray tracing as well. This is still a good-looking game, but it's squarely targeted towards lower-end and mid-range systems. Thankfully, that does yield great results for PS5 consoles, with a basically faultless turnout on Sony's current-gen base machine. High frame rates are married with good image quality here, producing a very solid and stable current-gen game. We'll take a look at PS5 Pro and Xbox Series consoles and follow-up content, but the turnout on this generation's most popular console hardware is excellent. So Battlefield 6 might be a slightly uneven overall package, but it offers a healthy dose of multiplayer fun, with good graphics and excellent performance. This is a very successful Battlefield outing on PS5. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/digitalfoundry for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media.